The dust settled around Jake McCready's boots as he dismounted his weathered mare outside the general store in Sweetwater Creek. It was a town that had seen better days. Much like himself, the year was 1887, and the frontier was changing faster than a man could keep up with. Railroad tracks now cut through what used to be endless open range, and the cattle drives that had defined his life for the past 15 years were becoming fewer and farther between. Jake was 42 years old, though the lines etched deep around his eyes and the silver threading through his dark beard made him look older. 23 years of cowboy life had left their mark on him, from the scar above his left eyebrow courtesy of an ornery bull to the permanent squint from countless days under the unforgiving sun. He lived alone in a small cabin 15 miles outside of town, with only his horse Stella and an aging cattle dog named Rusty for company. As he tied Stella's reins to the hitching post, Jake noticed something that made him pause. Huddled in the narrow alley between the general store and the saloon were four figures that didn't belong to the usual collection of drifters and cowhands that passed through town. A woman, thin as a rail fence, sat with her back against the brick wall, her arms wrapped protectively around three children. The oldest couldn't have been more than 12, a boy with sandy hair and clothes that had seen too many washings. Beside him sat a girl of maybe 8, her dark hair in tangles, clutching a ragged cloth doll. The youngest, a boy who looked to be about 5, had his face buried in his mother's shoulder. Jake had always minded his own business. It was a survival trait in his line of work, and it had served him well through the years. But something about the sight of that family, so clearly displaced and desperate, tugged at something deep in his chest that he'd kept buried for a long time. He bought his supplies quickly, loading flour, beans, coffee, and salt pork into his saddlebags. As he emerged from the store, he glanced again toward the alley. The woman was awake now, her eyes following the movements of townspeople with the wariness of someone who'd learned not to expect kindness from strangers. When her gaze met his, Jake saw something that hit him like a punch to the gut. It wasn't just desperation he saw there, but a fierce determination to protect her children no matter what it cost her. Jake had loved a woman once. Her name was Sarah, and she'd died of fever during their second year of marriage, taking their unborn child with her. That was 18 years ago, but the memory still had the power to stop him cold sometimes, usually when he least expected it. He walked over to the alley, his spurs jangling softly with each step. The woman tensed as he approached, pulling her children closer. Up close, Jake could see that she'd been pretty once, before hunger and hardship had hollowed out her cheeks and put dark circles under her green eyes. Her dress, though clean, was patched in several places, and her shoes were worn thin at the soles. "Mom," Jake said, touching the brim of his hat. "Name's Jake McCready. I couldn't help but notice you and your children here, you folks traveling through." The woman's chin lifted slightly, and Jake recognized the gesture as pride fighting against desperation. "We're managing just fine, thank you kindly," she said, though her voice carried a slight tremor that betrayed her words. "I'm sure you are," Jake said gently. "But if you don't mind me asking, where are you folks headed?" For a moment, the woman's composure cracked, and Jake saw the exhaustion beneath her brave facade. The oldest boy, sensing his mother's struggle, spoke up. "We're going to California, sir. Arpa said there's work there in the orchards." "Hush now, Tommy," the woman said quietly, though not unkindly. Jake crouched down to be at eye level with the family. "California's a long way from here. You folks got provisions for the journey?" The silence that followed told Jake everything he needed to know. The woman, who still hadn't given her name, looked away, her jaw set in a hard line. "Look," Jake said, standing back up, "I've got a place about 15 miles out of town. Nothing fancy, just a cabin and some outbuildings. But there's a well with sweet water, and I've got a garden that needs tending. If you folks are willing to work, there's a roof over your heads and regular meals while you figure out your next move." The woman looked up at him with suspicion. "What would you want in return?" Jake had been expecting the question, and he respected her for asking it straight out. A woman alone with 3 children had to be careful about trusting strangers, especially men. "Nothing you wouldn't be comfortable giving," he said. "I could use help with the cooking and mending. The boy there looks old enough to help with the livestock. And I reckon those little ones could manage gathering eggs and such. We don't take charity," the woman said, though Jake could hear the internal battle in her voice. "Wouldn't be charity," Jake replied. "Be honest work for honest pay, room and board. and maybe a little extra to help you on your way when you're ready to move on." The little girl with the doll whispered something to her mother, too quiet for Jake to hear. The woman's eyes filled with tears that she blinked away quickly. The youngest boy had fallen asleep against her shoulder, and Jake could see the exhaustion in every line of her body. "My name is Mary Catherine O'Brien," she said finally. "These are my children. Tommy there and Katie, and this little one is Michael. Their father," she paused, swallowing hard. "Their father died 6 months ago in a mining accident back in Colorado. The company put us out of the company housing, and we've been traveling ever since." Jake felt something shift inside his chest, like a door that had been locked for 18 years suddenly creaking open. "Well then, Mrs. O'Brien, what do you say we get you and the children somewhere safe for the night?" Mary Catherine studied his face for a long moment, clearly weighing her limited options. Finally, she nodded. "We're grateful for your kindness, Mr. McCready, but I want you to know we'll earn our keep. I won't have my children thinking they can depend on the charity of strangers." Jake smiled, the first genuine smile he'd managed in months. "I wouldn't expect anything less, Mom." The ride to Jake's cabin took the better part of 2 hours, with Mary Catherine and little Michael riding double on Stella while Jake walked alongside, leading the horse. Tommy and Katie took turns riding and walking, their spirits lifting noticeably the farther they got from town. By the time they reached the homestead, the sun was hanging low on the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Jake's cabin was modest but well built, with 2 rooms and a small loft accessible by a ladder. He'd built it himself after buying the land with money saved from years of cattle drives. There was a barn, a chicken coop, and a small corral where he kept Stella and the 2 horses he'd been breaking for a neighbor. A vegetable garden stretched along the south side of the house, and a clear stream ran through the property about 50 yards from the back door. "It's beautiful," Katie breathed, clutching her doll tighter as she took in the sight of the little homestead. Mary Catherine said nothing, but Jake saw her shoulders relax for the first time since he'd met her. The children explored the immediate area around the cabin, while Jake showed her the inside. The main room served as both kitchen and living area, with a stone fireplace taking up most of one wall. A small table and 4 chairs sat near the single window, and Jake's narrow bed was tucked into one corner. "The children can have the loft," Jake said. "I'll string up a blanket for privacy. You can have the bed, and I'll make do with my bedroll by the fire." "Mr. McCready," Mary Catherine began, but Jake held up his hand. "Jake," he corrected, "and it's no trouble at all. Been sleeping under the stars more often than not anyway." That first evening set the tone for what followed. Mary Catherine proved to be an excellent cook, transforming Jake's simple supplies into the best meal he'd had in years. The children, initially shy, gradually warmed up to him as he shared stories of his life on the range. Tommy was fascinated by Jake's tales of cattle drives and asked endless questions about horses and roping. Katie showed him her doll, carefully explaining that her name was Rose and that she'd belonged to Caddy's grandmother back in Ireland. Little Michael mostly stayed close to his mother, but Jake caught him watching everything with wide, curious eyes. As the days turned into weeks, Jake found himself looking forward to coming home each evening. The cabin, which had always felt empty despite his presence, suddenly seemed alive. Mary Catherine had a gift for making even the most humble space feel warm and welcoming. She mended tears in Jake's clothes that he'd barely noticed, organized his few possessions with an efficiency that amazed him, and somehow made his simple meals taste like feasts. The children brought their own special brand of chaos and joy to his orderly existence. Tommy proved himself eager to learn and quick to pick up the skills Jake taught him. Within a week, the boy could saddle a horse competently and was learning to use a rope. Katie appointed herself caretaker of the chickens and took her duties seriously, gathering eggs each morning and talking to the hens as if they were old friends. Even little Michael began to come out of his shell, following Jake around the property and asking questions in his piping voice. But it was Mary Catherine who affected Jake most profoundly. She worked from dawn to dusk without complaint, tackling any task that needed doing with a determination that both impressed and worried him. She'd taken over the vegetable garden completely, and under her care it flourished as it never had before. She cooked, cleaned, mended, and somehow found time to help her children with their letters and numbers in the evenings. What struck Jake most about her was her strength. She'd been dealt a devastating blow when her husband died, left alone with 3 young children and no resources. Most people would have been crushed by such circumstances, but Mary Catherine had simply endured and kept moving forward. She never complained, never spoke bitterly of her circumstances, and never let her children see her moments of private grief. Jake began to see those moments, though. Sometimes he'd catch her standing at the window, staring out at the horizon with an expression of such profound sadness that it made his chest ache. Or he'd wake in the night to the sound of quiet crying coming from behind the blanket that divided her sleeping area from the rest of the room. One evening in late October, as they sat around the table after supper, Tommy asked the question that Jake had been dreading. "Ma, when are we leaving for California?" The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken emotions. Mary Catherine's face went carefully blank. The expression Jake had learned meant she was fighting to maintain her composure. Katie looked up from where she was dressing her doll, sudden worry clouding her young features. "Soon, I expect," Mary Catherine said finally. "We've imposed on Mr. McCready's hospitality long enough." "But I like it here," Katie said, her lower lip trembling. "I don't want to leave Rose's chickens." "The chickens don't belong to your doll, sweetheart," Mary Catherine said gently. "They belong to Mr. McCready." Jake felt something twist in his stomach. The truth was, he didn't want them to leave either. Over the past month and a half, this family had become more precious to him than he'd realized. The thought of going back to his solitary existence, of eating silent meals and spending long evenings with no sound but the wind and Rusty's occasional snoring, filled him with a loneliness he'd forgotten he was capable of feeling. What if they didn't have to leave? The words were out of his mouth before Jake realized he was going to say them. 4 pairs of eyes turned to him, and he felt his face flush under their scrutiny. Mary Catherine's expression was carefully neutral. "What do you mean?" Jake took a deep breath, knowing he was about to change his life irrevocably. "I mean, what if you stayed? Permanently, all of you, Mr. McCready." "Jake," he corrected automatically. "Hear me out, please. I've been thinking about this for a while now. This place has never felt more like a home than it has these past weeks. The children are happy here and well, you've worked harder than any hired hand I ever had. You've more than earned your keep." Mary Catherine's hands were clasped tightly in her lap, and Jake could see the conflict playing out across her features. We can't impose on you indefinitely. You have your own life, your own plans," Jake asked, and the question came out more bitter than he'd intended. "I'm 42 years old, and I've got nothing to show for it but a few head of cattle and a cabin that's felt more like a prison than a home for the past 18 years. You want to know the truth? I need this family more than you need me." Tommy leaned forward eagerly. "You mean we could stay? Really stay?" "If your mother agrees," Jake said, looking directly at Mary Catherine. "I'm not talking about charity, Mary. I'm talking about a partnership. We could make this place into something real, something lasting. Your children could grow up with roots, with stability." Mary Catherine was quiet for so long that Jake began to think he'd made a terrible mistake in speaking. When she finally looked up at him, her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Why?" she asked simply. It was the hardest question she could have asked, because it required Jake to admit things to himself that he'd been avoiding for weeks. "Because when I found you and the children in that alley, something changed in me. Because I've been half alive for 18 years, and you've reminded me what it feels like to be whole. Because those children deserve better than uncertainty, and because," he paused, swallowing hard, "because I love all of you. Not the way a man loves a woman he hopes to court, Mary. I'm not asking for that. Though I won't lie and say the thought hasn't crossed my mind. I love you the way a man loves his family." The silence that followed seemed to stretch forever. Katie had stopped fussing with her doll and was looking back and forth between her mother and Jake with wide eyes. Tommy was grinning broadly, clearly ready to accept the offer immediately. Little Michael had fallen asleep in his chair, unaware of the momentous conversation taking place around him. Mary Catherine wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "I don't know what to say." "Say yes, Ma," Tommy urged. "Please. I like it here, I like Jake, and I want to learn to be a real cowboy. The chickens would miss me if I left," Katie added seriously. "And Rose likes it here too." Mary Catherine looked around the table at her children, then back at Jake. "You're sure about this?" "Really sure. Because once my children get their hearts set on something, it's hard to change their minds." Jake smiled, feeling lighter than he had in years. I've never been more sure of anything in my life. Mary Catherine's answering smile was like sunrise after the longest night. Then yes. Yes, we'll stay. But I have conditions. Name them. I pull my own weight. Always. I'm not your housekeeper or your cook, I'm your partner. We make decisions about this place together. Agreed. And my children are never made to feel like they're charity cases. They earn their place here just like everyone else. Already do, Jake said, nodding toward Tommy. That boy's got the makings of a fine horseman. And Katie's got those chickens laying better than they have in years. Mary Catherine's smile widened, and Jake saw hope replacing the wariness in her green eyes. Then I suppose we're home. The word home hung in the air between them, heavy with promise and possibility. Jake had thought he'd known what loneliness was during his years alone, but he realized now that he'd simply been existing, not living. This family had brought him back to life in ways he was only beginning to understand. As winter settled over the homestead, the little family found their rhythm. Jake taught Tommy everything he knew about horses and cattle, and the boy proved to be a natural. He had good hands and an instinctive understanding of animals that couldn't be taught. Katie continued to dote on the chickens and began helping Mary Catherine with more complex cooking tasks. She also started following Jake around, asking endless questions about everything from why horses needed shoes to where babies came from, the latter question sending Jake to Mary Catherine for backup. Little Michael slowly overcame his shyness, and Jake discovered that the boy had inherited his mother's gift for making things grow. Together, they planned an expanded garden for the spring, and Michael showed surprising knowledge about plants for someone so young. Mary Catherine proved herself to be everything Jake had hoped for in a partner and more. She had ideas for improving the property that Jake never would have considered, from expanding the chicken coop to starting a small orchard. She was also a natural with the horses, and Jake began teaching her to ride properly. Watching her face light up as she gained confidence in the saddle reminded him of why he'd fallen in love with this life in the first place. But perhaps most importantly, she brought laughter back to the homestead. Jake had forgotten how good it felt to smile until his face hurt, or to lie in his bedroll at night listening to the comfortable sounds of a family settling in for sleep. The cabin was full of life now, full of voices and movement and all the small dramas that came with children. There were difficult moments too. Tommy sometimes grew quiet and withdrawn, missing the father he'd never see again. Katie had nightmares occasionally, waking the whole household with her cries. Michael went through a phase of clinging to his mother, terrified that she might disappear like his father had. And Mary Catherine still had her moments of private grief, though they came less frequently as time passed. Jake found himself becoming not just a protector and provider for this family, but something more complex. He was part father figure, part older brother, part friend, and part something else he didn't have a name for. He helped Mary Catherine comfort the children when they grieved, and he found that she returned the favor when his own old wounds occasionally reopened. One snowy evening in December, as they sat around the fire after the children had gone to bed, Mary Catherine asked him about Sarah. It was the first time anyone had asked about his wife in years, and Jake found himself telling the whole story. How they'd met at a church social in Abilene. How he'd been instantly smitten with her laugh, and the way she wasn't afraid to speak her mind. How they'd married after a brief courtship and started planning a family immediately. And how it had all ended too soon, leaving him with nothing but memories and a hole in his heart that he'd convinced himself could never be filled. She sounds wonderful, Mary Catherine said when he finished. Jake agreed. For a long time I thought that was it for me. Thought I'd had my chance at happiness and lost it. Mary Catherine was quiet for a moment, staring into the flames. Patrick and I weren't. We weren't a love story, she said finally. We were practical. Two people who needed each other and decided to make the best of it. He was a good man, a good provider, and he loved the children. But what we had was more like a business partnership with affection than a grand romance. Jake wasn't sure how to respond to that admission, so he simply nodded. I used to wonder what it would be like. Mary Catherine continued. To be loved the way women are loved in the novels Katie likes me to read to her. To have someone choose me not because I was convenient or suitable, but because they couldn't imagine life without me. The admission hung between them, vulnerable and honest. Jake felt his heart start to beat faster, and he realized that the careful boundaries he'd drawn around his feelings for Mary Catherine were beginning to crumble. You deserve that, he said quietly. You deserve to be loved that way. Mary Catherine looked at him, then really looked at him, and Jake saw his own feelings reflected in her eyes. So do you, she whispered. They didn't speak of it again that night, but something had shifted between them. Jake found himself noticing things about Mary Catherine that he'd been trying not to see. The way she hummed while she worked, the graceful movement of her hands as she kneaded bread, the soft sound of her voice as she told the children bedtime stories. He began to realize that what he felt for her went far beyond gratitude or partnership. And Mary Catherine seemed to be having the same realization about him. He caught her watching him sometimes, when she thought he wasn't looking. She began finding excuses to touch him in passing, a hand on his shoulder as she set his coffee cup down, her fingers brushing his as she passed him something across the table. Spring came early that year, and with it came a restlessness that Jake recognized from his younger days. It was the time when cowhands traditionally moved on, when the wandering life called to those who hadn't yet found a reason to stay in one place. But for the first time in his adult life, Jake felt no urge to saddle up and ride toward the horizon. He had everything he wanted right here. The children had grown and changed over the winter. Tommy had shot up several inches and his voice was beginning to crack. He could handle a horse as well as many grown men, and Jake had started trusting him with more responsibility around the homestead. Katie had lost 2 teeth and gained an impressive vocabulary, much of it picked up from Jake's occasional colorful language. She was also learning to read with remarkable speed, devouring every book they could get their hands on. Michael had come completely out of his shell and proved to have his mother's gift for organization, keeping track of the chickens' egg production and the garden supplies with the seriousness of a bank clerk. And Mary Catherine had bloomed like the flowers in her garden. The worry lines around her eyes had faded, and she'd gained back the weight she'd lost during their difficult months on the road. She laughed freely now, and Jake sometimes caught glimpses of the young woman she'd been before loss and hardship had aged her beyond her years. It was on a warm day in May, as they worked together planting the expanded garden, that everything came to a head. The children were off exploring the creek, and Jake and Mary Catherine were working side by side in comfortable silence. Jake had just finished digging a row for the beans when he looked up to find Mary Catherine watching him with an expression he'd never seen before. "What?" he asked, suddenly self-conscious. "I was just thinking," she said, wiping her hands on her apron, "about what you said that first night, about loving us like family." Jakey's heart started beating faster. "What about it?" Mary Catherine took a step closer to him, and Jake caught the scent of the lavender soap she'd taken to making from flowers that grew wild on the hillside. "I was wondering if you still felt that way. Like family, I mean." Jake set down his hoe and gave her his full attention. "Why do you ask?" "Because I don't," she said simply. "Feel like family, that is. Not anymore." The words hung in the air between them, loaded with possibility and fear in equal measure. Jake felt his throat go dry. "Mary Catherine," he began, but she held up a hand to stop him. "Let me say this while I have the courage," she said. "I know this wasn't what you planned when you offered to help us. I know you were being kind to a family in trouble, and I don't want you to feel obligated to anything more than that. But I need you to know that I've fallen in love with you, Jake McCready. Not grateful love, not the affection of a friend or partner, but the kind of love that makes it hard to breathe when you're not around." Jake stared at her, hardly able to believe what he was hearing. "Mary, I'm not finished," she said, though her voice was trembling now. "I know I come with complications. 3 children, a past, responsibilities that will always come first. I can't offer you the simple love of a young woman with no attachments. But what I can offer you is real, and it's forever, and it's yours if you want it." Jake closed the distance between them in 2 steps, cupping her face in his hands. Her skin was soft and warm, and he could see his own wonder reflected in her green eyes. "Mary Catherine O'Brien," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I have loved you since the day I found you in that alley. I've loved you through every sunrise and sunset, through every laugh and tear, through every moment of every day we've spent together. I love your strength and your gentleness, your fierce protectiveness of your children, and your kindness to a lonely old cowboy. I love the way you make this house feel like a home, and the way you make me feel like the man I always hoped I could be." Mary Catherine's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. "Is that a yes?" Instead of answering with words, Jake kissed her. It was gentle and sweet and full of all the longing he'd been carrying for months. When they finally broke apart, both of them were breathless. "Mama! Jem, quick!" Tommy's shout from the direction of the creek broke the spell, and they reluctantly stepped apart. But as they hurried toward the sound of the children's voices, Jake reached for Mary Catherine's hand, and she laced their fingers together as naturally as breathing. They found the children clustered around something in the shallows of the creek, their faces bright with excitement. It was a foal, barely old enough to stand, clearly separated from its mother. The little horse was exhausted and frightened, but uninjured. "Can we keep him?" Katie asked immediately. "Please, he's all alone, just like we were." Jake and Mary Catherine exchanged a look over the children's heads, and Jake saw his own thoughts reflected in her eyes. This little family had been built from a collection of strays finding each other when they needed it most. "Well," Jake said, kneeling down beside the foal, "I reckon we'd better find his mama first. But if she's nowhere to be found, I suppose we could make room for one more." Tommy whooped with excitement, and Katie clapped her hands together. Michael immediately started planning out loud where the foal would sleep and what they would feed him. As they worked together to coax the frightened animal back to the homestead, Jake marveled at how his life had changed. A year ago, he'd been a man with nothing but his name and a few possessions, convinced that his best years were behind him. Now he had a family, a purpose, and a love deeper than anything he'd imagined possible. That evening, as they sat around the supper table with the orphaned foal sleeping in a makeshift stall in the barn, Jake made an announcement. "I've been thinking," he said, "about making some changes around here. Legal changes." Mary Catherine looked up from cutting Michael's meat, her eyebrows raised questioningly. Jake took a deep breath. "I'd like to adopt the children, officially. Make them McCready's in name as well as in fact, and I'd like their mother to take my name too, if she's willing." The silence that followed was broken by Katie's excited squeal. "You mean we'd really be your children, really and truly?" "Really and truly," Jake confirmed, looking around the table at the faces that had become more precious to him than his own life. "If you'll have me." Tommy was grinning so widely Jake thought his face might split. "Does this mean I can tell people you're my pie?" "You can tell anyone you want," Jake said, his voice thick with emotion. Michael, who had been quietly absorbing the conversation, finally spoke up. "Will you teach me to be a cowboy too?" "I'll teach you anything you want to learn, son." The words seemed to settle over all of them like a blessing. Jake looked at Mary Catherine, who was crying openly now, and reached for her hand across the table. "What do you say, Mary Catherine? Will you marry a broken-down old cowboy and make an honest man out of him?" "Yes," she whispered, then louder, "Yes, Jake McCready, I will." The children erupted in cheers, and even Rusty seemed to sense the celebration, barking excitedly from his place by the fireplace. Jake pulled Mary Catherine to her feet and spun her around the small kitchen while the children laughed and clapped. When he set her down, Jake looked around at his family, this gift he'd never expected to receive. 6 months ago, he'd been convinced that his life was winding down, that his best days were memories. Now he understood that he'd simply been waiting, that everything he'd experienced had been preparing him for this moment, this family, this love. They were married a month later in a simple ceremony at the little church in Sweetwater Creek. Mary Catherine wore her grandmother's wedding dress, which she'd carried with her through all their travels, carefully preserved in tissue paper at the bottom of their single trunk. Jake wore his best clothes and a new shirt that Mary Catherine had made for him, and he'd never felt more handsome or proud. Tommy stood as Jake's best man, solemn and important in his role. Katie scattered wildflowers from the meadow behind their house, and Michael held the rings with the gravity of someone entrusted with the crown jewels. The whole town came out for the wedding, drawn by curiosity about the mysterious family that had transformed the reclusive cowboy into a man who smiled when he came to town. As they exchanged vows, Jake thought about the day he'd found them in the alley. He'd made a split-second decision to help a family in trouble, never imagining that he was really rescuing himself. Sometimes the most important moments in life came disguised as ordinary choices, and sometimes the greatest gifts came in packages that didn't look like gifts at all. Mary Catherine had been right when she'd said she couldn't offer him the simple love of a young woman with no attachments. What she offered was infinitely more valuable. She offered him a love that had been tested by loss and hardship, a love that came with children who needed a father and responsibilities that would shape the rest of his life. She offered him a chance to be more than he'd ever been alone. And Jake had discovered that he'd been wrong about his own capacity for love. He'd thought that what he'd felt for Sarah was the deepest love he'd ever experienced, and in its own way, it had been. But what he felt for this family was different, richer, more complex. It was the love of a man who understood the preciousness of second chances. The love of someone who'd learned that the best things in life often came when you weren't looking for them. The years that followed were filled with all the joys and challenges that come with raising a family on the frontier. There were good seasons and bad seasons, years when the cattle prices were high and years when they struggled to make ends meet. There were illnesses and injuries, heartbreaks and celebrations, all the ordinary miracles that make up a life lived fully. Tommy grew into a fine young man, eventually taking over much of the ranch work and proving himself to be even better with horses than Jake had ever been. He married a neighbor's daughter when he turned 21, and they built a house on the far end of the property, close enough to help with the work but far enough away to have their own life. Katie became a teacher, the first in the county to be certified by the Territorial Education Board. She never married, claiming she was too busy with her students and her books, but Jake suspected she simply never found anyone who measured up to the father who'd chosen her when she needed choosing most. Michael surprised everyone by becoming a doctor, leaving home to attend medical school in the East and returning to set up practice in the growing town of Sweetwater Creek. He married the banker's daughter and gave Jake and Mary Catherine their first grandchildren, 2 little girls who visited the ranch every Sunday and kept their grandparents young. Jake and Mary Catherine grew old together, their love deepening and mellowing like good whiskey. They added rooms to the original cabin as their family grew, turning it into a sprawling ranch house that was always full of children and grandchildren and neighbors who'd learned that the McCready table was a place where everyone was welcome. Jake never regretted his decision to stop that day in Sweetwater Creek, to approach a desperate family in an alley and offer them hope. It had changed everything, just as the title of his story suggested. But more than that, it had taught him that sometimes the most important thing a person could do was simply pay attention to the people around them, to notice when someone needed help and to be brave enough to offer it. As he sat on his porch in his later years, watching his grandchildren play in the yard where his own children had grown up, Jake often reflected on the strange turns life could take. He'd spent the first 42 years of his life thinking he knew what happiness looked like, and then a homeless woman and her 3 children had shown him that he'd barely scratched the surface of what was possible. Love, he'd learned, wasn't just about finding the right person at the right time. Sometimes it was about being the right person when someone else needed you most. And sometimes the greatest gift you could give wasn't money or shelter or even safety, but simply the message that someone mattered, that their story wasn't over, that there was still hope for better days ahead. The little foal they'd rescued that day by the creek grew up to be the finest horse Jake ever owned. Gentle enough for the children to ride, but strong enough to work cattle. They named him Hope, and he lived to be nearly 30 years old. A testament to the power of second chances and the healing that could happen when broken things found the right place to grow whole again. And every year on the anniversary of the day Jake first saw Mary Catherine and her children in that alley, the whole family gathered at the ranch to tell the story again, to remember how their life together had begun with one man's decision to stop and care about strangers in need. It became a tradition, a reminder that the best stories weren't always the ones that began, once upon a time, but sometimes the ones that began with, "I couldn't help but notice." Jake McCready had set out that morning to buy supplies in town. He'd come home with a family, a future, and a love that would last the rest of his days. It was, he often said, the best trade he'd ever made.